So welcome to the workshop, Science News Literacy in the Time of COVID-19. I'm Dianna Sachs. I am the Health and Human Services Librarian, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Carrie Leatherman, our Natural Sciences Librarian. We're going to discuss several different types of fake news and how science is conducted and how it's reported on by different news organizations and how that impacts the way that we can responsibly consume science information and then use that information to make good decisions. And we will be putting a lot of that into context through examples around COVID-19. And in reverse, we'll be talking about how COVID-19 has really allowed us to better understand the gap in science news literacy that exists in much of our society. We are going to finish up with an activity where you can work on putting some of the principles into practice. So before we go any further, can I just get a clap or a thumbs up or some sort of indicator, maybe in chat? Can everybody hear me okay? Is all of this coming through properly for everyone? All right, I've seen a couple of thumbs up, so thank you for that. If at any time you have questions, feel free to put them in chat, or you feel free to just unmute yourself and ask your question. You'll also note on this main slide, and we will repeat this at the end, there is a link to a resource guide that Carrie and I have put together on science news literacy. So you can refer back to any of the resources that we discuss on that resource guide. So to start off, in 2016, the Washington Post reported on a research study that had been done by computer scientists in a collaboration from Columbia University and the French National Institute. And these researchers found that 59% of the links that were shared on social media had never been clicked. So that means that most people were sharing links through social media without ever actually reading the material. They just read the headlines. This is a particular concern. If we're sharing information without actually checking it ourselves, we might be propagating what we call so-called fake news. So I want to start by clarifying a few terms and some of the different kinds of phenomena that we often lump together under the category of fake news. First of all, there is misinformation. Misinformation is the unintentional spreading of false information, usually due to ignorance or confusion. And this is something that, frankly, everybody has done, and often with good intentions. We don't know that the information that we're sharing isn't true, or perhaps might only be partially true. Or maybe we're not thinking about the idea that the information is subject to being misinterpreted or misunderstood. So that's misinformation. There's also disinformation. Now, disinformation is knowingly sharing false information. It's intentionally lying about what you're sharing. Then there's propaganda, which is a type of disinformation or intentional lies, but built on a systematic scale. It's not just one person doing it. Now, another thing to watch out for is annihilation. Annihilation is a very specific type of disinformation which denies the reality or existence of the phenomenon in question. So, for example, following the Sandy Hook school shooting at the Sandy Hook Elementary School, which left 26 people dead, most of them little children, some conspiracy theorists started to promote the idea that those children not only had not been shot, but that the children never even existed, that the entire story was made up. So it's not just lying about the facts of the situation, it's denying that the situation even exists at all. That's annihilation. Now, I have also put an asterisk here next to opinion, because opinion, as long as it is clearly identified as opinion, is not considered fake news. But I have included it because many people treat opinion as though it were fact, or at least as though it can't be questioned. And that can lead to the spreading of misinformation. So most important thing for all of us is to be able to recognize when we encounter any of these types of so-called fake news and be prepared to do our part to stop its spread. So next up, I want to watch a quick video uh, which talks about the importance of science and how a good understanding of science can help us make good decisions, both as individuals and also as a society. So let me just change the settings here. Give me one moment to fix the sharing settings.
How did America rise up from a...
Sorry, one moment. Apparently. I apologize for that. Let me get the right thing here. All right, let's try this again.
How did America rise up from a backwoods country to be one of the greatest nations the world has ever known? We pioneered industries. And all of this required the greatest innovations in science and technology in the world. And so science is a fundamental part of the country that we are. But in this, the 21st century, when it comes time to make decisions about science, it seems to me people have lost the ability to judge what is true and what is not, what is reliable, what is not reliable, what should you believe, what should you not believe. And when you have people who don't know much about science, standing in denial of it and rising to power, that is a recipe for the complete dismantling of our informed democracy.
Let us demand that educators around America teach evolution not as fact, but as theory.
Increasing number of parents showing skepticism about vaccinations.
Voters have approved a ban on GMOs.
Call climate change unproven science.
That's not the country I remember growing up in. Not that we didn't have challenges. I'm old enough to remember the 60s and the 70s. We had a hot war and a cold war, civil rights movement, and all of this was going on. But I don't remember any time where people were standing in denial of what science was. One of the great things about science is that it is an entire exercise in finding what is true. You have a hypothesis, you test it, I get a result. A rival of mine double checks it because they think I might be wrong. They perform an even better experiment than I did and they find out, hey, this experiment matches. Oh my gosh, we're onto something here. And out of this rises a new emergent truth. It does it better than anything else we have ever come up with as human beings. This is science. It's not something to toy with. It's not something to say, I choose not to believe equals MC squared. You don't have that option. When you have an established scientific emergent truth, it is true whether or not you believe in it. And the sooner you understand that, the faster we can get on with the political conversations about how to solve the problems that face us. So once you understand that humans are warming the planet, you can then have a political conversation about that. You can say, well, are there carbon credits? Do we do this? Do we put a tariff on it? Do we fund? Do we subsidize? Those have political answers. And every minute one is in denial, you are delaying the political solution that should have been established years ago. As a voter, as a citizen, scientific issues will come before you. And isn't it worth it to say, all right, let me at least become scientifically literate so that I can think about these issues and act intelligently upon them. Recognize what science is and allow it to be what it can and should be in the service of civilization. It's in our hands.
All right, we'll stop there. So now I'm going to turn things over to Carrie, who is going to talk a little bit more about build on some of the topics that Dr. Tyson talked about in that video. So go ahead, Carrie.
Okay, thank you, Diana. Okay, some compelling words from Dr. Tyson. So before we go on in our presentation, I think it's important for us to understand a few science-related terms that relate to science news literacy. And these terms can often cause confusion. The first one up on the slide is theory. In science, a theory is a tested and confirmed explanation for observations or phenomena. This is in contrast to normal everyday usage of the word theory. In that context, it means an idea or a possible explanation. For example, in a science context, gravity is a theory, but I'm guessing we can all agree that gravity is real and not merely a possible explanation of why something I drop falls down to the earth. Next is a hypothesis. It's a suggested explanation for why or how something happens, and it's testable. Again, in the science context, it's not a random guess. It's usually based on scientists' general understanding of related scientific principles, but still needs to be proven. And next is data, which is information, especially when it is analyzed or used as the basis for a decision. And in that scientific context, data is often collected during experiments and is often numerical. And on this slide, the last one is scientific method. And within the science context, that is defined as a clearly defined process for testing hypotheses. And it has very clear steps: making an observation, forming a hypothesis about that observation, designing and conducting an experiment, collecting data, comparing experimental results with your hypothesis, and then drawing conclusions about the experiment. Goal of the scientific method is to prove or disprove the hypothesis. The next slide, please. And then we have a couple other terms. First one is peer review. It's a process used to review science research articles to see if they are high quality and reliable enough to be published in a specific scholarly journal. In this peer review process, peers are generally scientists that are familiar with the science that the author of the article did. By peers, we often mean that these scientists have enough expertise to understand the science and the article that the article writer did, and those peers evaluate the research article. The reviewers evaluate whether it's a good enough experiment that was set up, if the scientists analyze their data in a statistically appropriate way, if the conclusions of the authors are reasonable, and if this is the case, if the peer reviewers think overall that the article and the experiment it reports on are good quality, the article will be published in a journal. Another term is scholarly communication. This is the process by which results of research are shared among researchers, typically including personal communication, presentations at conferences, and publishing in scholarly journals. This basically means that the science community shares their research findings and then discusses through publications and conference presentations what the conclusions from their research means within the larger context of their discipline. One study alone does not determine what is eventually seen as factual, or if it's proven a concept that comes over time within a conversation, a scholarly communication. Next slide, please. And the last of the terminology I'm going to talk about, thank you for bearing with us. I know it's a lot of terms we're throwing out here. The terms correlation and causation. In science and within a statistical concept, they mean a very specific thing. In general usage, correlation means that two things are related to each other or are happening at the same time. But within science and statistics, correlation means something very specific. It means how two or more numeric variables are related. Also in statistics, causation cannot be assumed just because two events are correlated. This is very important to understand in order to really grasp what these terms mean within results of a scientific experiment. Next slide, please. So as an example of this idea of correlation and causation, which cannot be assumed in scientific research, we have an example up on the screen. And on that graph, two things represented by those colored lines have a strong correlation, but we can probably all agree that there definitely isn't a causation between the two of them. In this example, it is showing that the annual per capita consumption of cheese in the US is strongly correlated with the annual number of people in the US that die by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. Let's pause for a minute and let that soak in. This chart on the screen shows that the correlation between these two very random things is very closely correlated. I also want to point out that this chart is from a website called Spurious Correlation. And the goal of this website is to show in a very humorous way that correlation does not always equal causation. All right, so how do researchers actually determine causation instead of only correlation? Well, that's beyond the scope of this talk. Correlation is almost impossible to prove. Or excuse me, causation, oh heavens, causation is almost impossible to prove. But a lot of statistics and debate goes into showing that there is such a strong correlation between two events that you can safely assume that one thing causes another. But the overall message of this is an important one, that correlation is not equal to causation when being a conscientious consumer of news coverage in science. Next slide, please. And back to Dianna.
Thanks, Carrie. If any of you want to explore some of the other spurious correlations on that website, they are really interesting and amusing examples. But going back to the issues of misinformation and which is again the unintentional sharing of false or misleading information. One of the ways it can spread is when information is taken out of context. And often in science news, it's hard to understand the true impact of something on our lives or on our society without that larger context. So, for example, we've all seen graphs like this one recently showing the number of COVID-19 cases and deaths in the United States or in the world or in Michigan. And some people are even suggesting that the coronavirus is really just like the flu, or that people who died of COVID-19 would have died anyway of something else. And the number of people that we're talking about are so hard to comprehend without context. Are these numbers large or small compared to other numbers? So let's take a look at some of the COVID-19 deaths in the United States in the larger context so that we can better understand these numbers that we're talking about. Here in this chart, we can see the number of people in 2018 and 2019 before the COVID-19 pandemic, the number of people who died of each of the leading causes of death in the United States. And you can see that the 2018 numbers are the darker bars and the 2019 numbers are the lighter bars. And as you can see here, heart disease and cancer are by far the two leading causes of death in the United States in 2018 and 19. Much smaller would be unintentional injuries or accidents, followed by chronic lower respiratory disease, stroke, Alzheimer's disease, and so on. And as we get further down, the percentage of the total is much smaller. So that's 2018 and 19 before the COVID-19 pandemic. Here's the provisional data for 2020. Now, I will point out that this data for 2020 is provisional because some of the final numbers from the end of 2020 are still being reported from various hospitals and states to the national database. But this still gives a pretty good overview. So again, just like in 2018 and 19, heart disease and cancer remain the largest causes of death, but COVID-19 is showing up as the third leading cause of death in 2020. It's overtaken unintentional injury or accident. It's overtaken stroke, chronic respiratory disease, Alzheimer. One thing that's particularly interesting to note is how much larger the bar for COVID-19 is over the bar for influenza and pneumonia. Because many of us have heard of people saying that COVID-19 is just like the flu. But if you look at the number of people who died from COVID-19 in 2020 compared with the number of people who died from influenza and other types of pneumonia, it's quite a bit more. So this gives us a better sense, instead of just some of these random numbers, well, I shouldn't say random numbers, but instead of just some of these numbers, this puts these numbers into context so that we can better understand them. Here's another way of looking at the data from 2020. Again, another way of putting it into context. The darker blue bars at the bottom are the number of people who died of non-COVID causes in 2020. And the lighter blue bars are those who died of COVID-19. And this chart is it's an easy way to see the ratios of how many deaths on a week-by-week basis in this chart, how many deaths were due to COVID-19 versus all other causes. Now, another example of putting information into context. This past summer, there's been a surge of misinformation around the use of ivermectin as an alternative treatment to COVID-19. Ivermectin is a cheap, easily available antiparasitic drug that's commonly used to treat intestinal parasites in animals and scabies, lice, and a few other kinds of parasites in humans. It's being touted by some people, both in the scientific community and not, as a so-called miracle cure. And Carrie's going to talk a bit more about how the misinformation around ivermectin has spread in a few minutes. Now, since the human formulation of the drug is only available with a prescription, some people are turning to the formulation that's actually designed for livestock. And this has led to a surge in media coverage. And a growing fear that large numbers of people are going to be poisoning themselves by ingesting ivermectin that's designed for cows and horses. But again, it's important to look at this information in context. So between July and August of this year, 2021, there was an increase in cases of ivermectin exposure related to poison control centers throughout the United States of 245%. And that sounds like a really big number, and it has the potential to be a really scary number. But when we look at the numbers in context, we see that nationwide, the number of cases of ivermectin exposure that were reported to poison control went from 133 in July to 459 in August. And that's a worrying trend, definitely, that increase. But it's only a drop in the bucket when you compare it to the total number of exposures to all different kinds of poisons that were reported to poison control centers of over 2.1 million. Now, it's also important to remember that while there is no good evidence right now that ivermectin is helpful for treating COVID-19, there's also no definitive evidence to show that it doesn't help. And there's still a lot of active research going on right now to determine whether or not a safe human formulated dose in any context or combination with other treatments can actually be an effective treatment. But the important thing to note is we don't have that evidence yet one way or the other. We're still waiting for the results of that scholarly conversation that Carrie was talking about earlier. We're still waiting for the results of enough research to have been done and to have been critically analyzed for us to have the information around this topic.
So that idea of how this sort of information goes from a researcher to the news media to consumers of information sources, how journalism actually interprets science and how that relates to a science news cycle. Up on the screen right now, we have a cartoon that actually helps us put into context how this science news cycle actually takes place, how scientific research is covered by the media. The cartoon is funny, but actually pretty accurate, and an overview of how science research is covered and how it influences public understanding of the results of scientific research. And just as a really brief overview of what the cartoon is pointing out, at the top of the cartoon, there is a scientist writing an article about how they've done some scientific research and how they have made a discovery that they have then published in a scholarly article. Next in the cycle, as we move kind of right and down through the cycle, the media, news, wire services, newspapers, cable TV, local news stations, hear about the discovery that the scientists made and then published about. And then those news outlets report on the science findings, but in very generalized sorts of ways. For example, instead of noting that the scientists found some correlations in their scientific research, they report that something causes or causation causes something else, which is overgeneralizing. Then as we move to the left and up the cycle, you wind up with the public hearing about this generalized news coverage of a scientific study and perhaps draw conclusions that something causes something else, and they take the scientific findings out of context. Next slide, please. So what does that mean? Well, here's an example of how the science news cycle has gone wrong. There was a study published in 2020, I think mid-year, about June, by Kaylee and other scientists. An image of the article's front page is up on the slide. And basically, the study showed that ivermectin, this antiparasitic drug we were talking about, actually apparently kills COVID-19 in vitro. Okay. So why is that a big deal? Well, ivermectin is actually an antiparasitic drug developed in the early 1980s. It's great at treating parasitic diseases, and it has improved the health and well-being of countless people and livestock that were plagued by these difficult to treat parasitic diseases. In fact, two scientists that were involved in the work related to the discovery of ivermectin actually won Nobel Prizes in 2015. Fabulous, fabulous discoveries. So how did this get tied into the COVID pandemic? Well, this past year, there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of talk about whether ivermectin could actually cure COVID-19 in humans. And that takes us back to this article. Early in the pandemic, scientists were trying to find a drug that was effective against COVID-19. We were desperate for some sort of a cure or something to help people just not get as sick from this virus. There was a group of Australian scientists who published that paper up on the screen, reporting that, again, COVID-19 virus was killed in cell cultures, which is basically in a petri dish, by treating the cell culture with ivermectin. And that sounds wonderful, right? That's great, a cure for COVID. Well, catch was the doses they were testing at in this cell culture situation was at 100 times the amount that was safe for human doses. Okay, that's a little concerning. Also, again, they were testing in cell cultures, which basically is in a petri dish, not in human beings. So the results were covered in the news media that ivermectin was showing promise as curing COVID-19. People started hearing about this, thinking about it. And while other studies have been done to basically find out if this is the case, perhaps trying to prove that it could be an effective cure for COVID, a lot of these studies have been inconclusive. Some have even been retracted because the data was flawed, the methodology was flawed. In some cases, data was even faked. Again, backing up, it's not that ivermectin in itself is a bad drug. It has wonderful purposes, but it's also not that the study done by those Australian scientists was bad or wrong. The results of the study, through the news cycle being overgeneralized and through news consumers overgeneralizing the results of the study, contributed to some members of the public believing that ivermectin will cure COVID-19 when there currently isn't any clear scientific evidence that it does. Next slide, please. And I'm sorry, let me continue. Another way that the public's understanding of scientific findings can get muddled or overgeneralized is through something called cognitive biases. We are all subject to biases. We're simply human. But it's important to understand that these natural things that everybody has, biases, can cause challenges. They're inherently part of us, but we have to be aware of that. Cognitive biases are unconscious tendencies to process information in a way that is biased or irrational. They're like shortcuts that our brains take in order to help us make sense of information more efficiently. And we all demonstrate cognitive biases regardless of whether what our political beliefs are, our educational level. Once we are aware of these biases, it's easier for us to avoid them. One type of cognitive bias is called confirmation bias, and this is where a person has a tendency to process information by looking for information or interpreting it in ways that are consistent with our existing beliefs. And we can oftentimes ignore information or interpretations of information that challenge our beliefs. Okay, so confirmation bias and other cognitive biases can be made worse by a couple of other phenomena. First is echo chambers. These involve people around us, our friends and neighbors, and an echo chamber occurs when we connect with people on social media and in real life who have opinions similar to our own, and thereby leads us to having fewer people in our social world who challenge us and more people instead who reinforce our existing beliefs. It's like that confirmation bias that we have internally, but magnified by a group around us when we only interact with people who agree with us. Let's see, another phenomenon are filter bubbles, and this happens as a result of our interactions with information online. Filter bubbles occur when our internet searches and websites use algorithms to build profiles about us and then give us information that they assume we want. These profiles are often based on what we've clicked on in the past, like our search history, our location, and other demographic information. And as a result, though, the websites are more likely to give us only information that reinforces what we've done or looked for in the past, and it becomes more difficult for us to come into contact with contradicting viewpoints. So all of this means that we often aren't in our daily lives exposed to ideas that challenge our biases, which in turn can reinforce our existing biases. This means that we have to actively seek out points of view in order to challenge our biases, and this is especially important when dealing with complex information like science news. Next slide, please.
So as information consumers, there are some techniques that we could use to compensate for our biases and to spot so-called bad science and deal with science that's either being misrepresented or that might actually have been conducted poorly in the first place. So now we've spent the last half hour or so probably freaking you out a little bit with all of these problems. We're going to now offer you some tools to help you deal with these kinds of situations that you might encounter. So first of all, I'm going to put a link in chat, which will again take you to our resource guide for the media literacy resource guide. So the image that you see up on this slide is posted on that media literacy resource guide, so you can refer back to it and enlarge it as often as you need to. I'm just going to quickly go through a few of the main points on this guide as almost like an overview of some of the main techniques that you could use. But again, you can refer back to it as often as you need to. So first is watch out for clickbait headlines. Check to see if the news articles that you're reading accurately reflect what the original science researchers said, or if they're distorting the science for sensation. And check to see if the organization that's publishing the news article, the science news, has a history of only publishing science news that supports a particular point of view. Now, Carrie's already talked about the difference between correlation and causation. So check to make sure that news articles are not confusing one for the other and saying that there's absolute proof that something is caused by something else. And make sure that the news articles are providing evidence for any conclusions that they reach. Also, think about the methodology behind the scientific research study. Did the researchers include enough subjects in the study? Do those subjects actually represent the population as a whole? Did the researchers use a control group? Did they use blind testing? All of these are techniques that are a feature of high quality scientific research that is reliable and more likely to be verifiable. Also check to see if the news organizations that are reporting on these on scientific breakthroughs make sure that they haven't cherry-picked data from the study, or make sure that they're not reporting on research that can't be repeated or that hasn't gone through peer review so that it's been checked by other people who are experts in the field. And you're not entirely on your own for any of this. It's also useful to have a few reliable fact-checking resources in your back pocket. Now, many of you are probably familiar with Snopes.com, which has investigated many claims in science news. Another great tool is SciCheck, which is part of factcheck.org, which is a nonprofit organization that focuses on science information. And these are linked on our media literacy guide also, so you can refer back to them as needed. So now that we've talked about the different tools that you can use to critically evaluate science information, we'd actually like you to do a quick activity. So I'm putting a link in chat that will take you to a Google Sheet. And there, at the top of that Google Doc, or let me open up the Google Doc right here. At the top of this Google Doc, there is a link to an article, Yellowstone supervolcano may blow sooner than thought, could wipe out life on the planet. It's from a newspaper, The Tennessean. I believe that's out of Nashville, but it might be out of Memphis or one of the, but it's a major newspaper. Oh, okay, yes, it is out of Nashville. So this article, we're going to ask you to skim this article from The Tennessean and think about how the article is presenting the scientific research information about the volcanic activity at Yellowstone Park. Then, after you've done a quick skim of this article, we'd like you to do some quick web searching. You could use Google or whatever search engine you use to find other sources, other news reports that are reporting on the same research. And pick one, doesn't matter which one, and answer the questions that are listed on the table in this document. One hint that I will give you when it comes to searching for other examples of news organizations reporting on this research is to use as some of your search terms the name of the researcher involved in the original research study, and also look for articles that were published around the same time as this article in the Tennessean. So we'll give you about 5 to 7 minutes to take a quick skim of the article from the Tennessean, and then see if you can find a report from another news organization that's also on the same topic and answer the questions in this chart. And if anybody's having trouble accessing the document, just make a note in chat and we can help you out. Remember that what you put in the chart should be another example from a different news organization other than this Tennessean article. Okay, let's just take about one more minute. If anybody else is able to find an article, or maybe you already found an article, if you're able to find another article, you could always stick it in there. Okay, so the article that we shared from the Tennessean and the others that you have indicated in this table, and thank you for participating, by the way, for those articles, they all have varying degrees of sensationalism in their headlines. Now I want to share a statement from the author of the original research study that is being reported on in all of these other news outlets. Hannah Shamloo was the author of the study that is being discussed. And she put on her own webpage, seeing Yellowstone in the news a lot lately, worried that it's going to blow? No need for panic. Here are some things to keep in mind. And she goes on to say that the volcano is being monitored regularly, and it is not anywhere close to being in a eruptive state. That the publication, and this is particularly useful, number 3 here, the publication that she and her colleagues wrote that was covered in this, she's talking about the New York Times, but it was picked up by all of these different news organizations, investigated the magmatic events that are likely to lead to that likely led to the last super eruption over 600,000 years ago. And that their results that she and her colleagues came up with suggest a magmatic recharge event occurred on the order of years or decades at most prior to eruption. This does not equate to a prediction of a future eruption. Instead, this information can be used in a potential future eruption as a stopwatch between the detection of unusual activity and eruption. So she and her colleagues are not saying that the volcano is likely to blow soon. They're simply saying that they are measuring some characteristics around the last time the volcano erupted over 600,000 years ago and comparing that with some other characteristics that are going on now. So all of this goes back to taking that information in context and using our critical thinking when exploring information. So I'm going to pass it up to Carrie, who's going to finish up today with some suggestions for reliable science news sources.
Okay, thank you. So yes, so reliable news sources. We've talked so much about the news cycle going wrong, but there are some places to actually find information that sources that report on science information very well. A couple of scholarly journals, one called Science and one called Nature, both have news pages on their websites. These two journals are two of the most highly regarded scientific journals being published in the world right now. And the science news coverage on both of these websites is reliable and accurate. Also written for an educated general audience. They won't have a lot of technical jargon in the news reporting. Science News is another publication. This is published by the Society for Science, which is a nonprofit dedicated to expanding scientific literacy, effective STEM education, and scientific research. This is an excellent site, again, with high quality journalism. Two sources are actually a couple of major newspapers, the New York Times and the Washington Post. Both are highly regarded newspapers that have high quality journalism. Often these newspapers are criticized as being left-leaning politically, but regardless of your opinion about this, their science news coverage is very high quality. I also want to throw out there that as WMU students, you have access to all of these publications that are actually have a subscription fee to others outside of this institution. Once you graduate, there are some restrictions on access to these back issues because they are, again, subscription publications. And it can be a hassle to have to pay for these, even outside of the student here. But you get what you're paid for. These are high quality science sources. Okay, so questions. What questions do you have about what we covered? Let's just pause for a moment to see if anybody wants to unmute or post something in the chat. Long, awkward silence. Okay. If you do have questions, by all means, unmute, post in the chat. Meanwhile, I want to point out two things on the slide right now. One is a survey link. And Diana, if you could plop that in the chat. We have a very brief online feedback survey we'd love for you guys to take. It lets us know how we're doing, if this workshop actually met your needs, if you found it interesting, if there's something we can do differently. We really appreciate your feedback. We read it and take it to heart when planning these sorts of workshops. The second link up on the slide is the guide that we had talked about earlier in the presentation that contains a lot of the information related to what we talked about in this workshop. This is something you can access indefinitely after the presentation if you have any questions or need some follow-up information about what we just covered today. Okay.
I've put the, oh, please go ahead.
Yes.
No. Oh, if somebody was trying to speak, please do go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. I've also put in chat links to the different science news organizations that Carrie is recommending as good sources of generally responsible and reliable science news reporting. If any of you have any questions in the future, please, we hope that you will contact us. We'll look forward to hearing from you. We have recorded this session, and we will, when you registered for the session, you did provide your email address. So we will make sure that you get a copy of the session that you can review. I know at least one person was having some technical issues and was coming in and out, so we can make sure that you have the full copy. And we hope that you will let us know if you've got questions about science news literacy or anything related to science research in the future.
And I just want to add that I put my email address as well as Diana's in the chat. So please feel free to copy it down. If you have questions, this is literally our job. We love helping people with this kind of information requests. So just hit us up and we'll help you out.
Yep. And feel free to just do a full-on copy paste of everything in the chat. We'll look forward to hearing from you. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Thank you.